Hello, I'm Ilan Shor, and you're watching TVP World Talks, where every word matters. Moldova is facing a pivotal moment in its history. Presidential elections in which Maia Sandu is fighting for a second term, but also, crucially, a referendum on the country's future within the European Union. One would say, well, this is just the way the democratic system works. However, there have been many reports of Russian interference. Russia wants this referendum to fail. It doesn't want Moldova to proceed on its path to Europe. Instead, it wants to draw it back into its sphere of influence. So who's going to win this particular skirmish? In the polling stations and beyond? Well, we're going to talk about this with our guest, Grigol Julukhidze, Director at the Foreign Policy Council. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning, Jonas, and thanks for inviting me. But one correction, I'm not the director of the Foreign Policy Council anymore because we had to eliminate our organization because of this law about foreign influences. And that's why I have a different, I would say, job position right now. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course, I'm glad that you could join us here. And for the sake of clarity, you're referring to the Georgian law on organizations which are acting with foreign support. The infamous law that has been making the headlines in Georgia. But that is, of course, another story, a very important one. Nevertheless, we're now coming back to Moldova. Many reports about Russian interference. Allegedly, $100 million is the amount that Russia was prepared to spend on various activities designed to discourage people from voting yes in the referendum. So, do you think that the referendum is at a serious risk of either failing or producing results which would not reflect the actual public sentiment?
Frankly speaking, we were expecting such actions from the Kremlin. It's a very well-known modus operandi of the Russian Federation. But I'm not sure that these tactics will work in this regard. First of all, I have to mention that turnout on Sunday is predicted to be high, above 80%. A recent poll suggests Sandu could win over 35% of the vote on Sunday, with Stoyanoglo coming a distant second with 9%. There are several other candidates, the majority of whom are pro-Russian. However, almost 30% of voters were still undecided, according to the polls. If no candidate gets more than 50% of the vote, the presidential election will go to a runoff vote on November 3rd. Although Sandu should comfortably win both rounds, parliamentary elections next July looks less positive for her party, which may have to work with less staunchly pro-Western, pro-EU forces if it wants to govern. One figure who looms large over the election, although he's not a candidate, is Ilan Shor, a businessman and politician. His Shor party was banned in Moldova last year following allegations of working with Russia to undermine Moldova's security and constitutional order. Shor fled to Israel in 2019 after being convicted of fraud and money laundering, and has recently been living in Russia. He makes no secret.
No surprises there, right? I mean, he's directing his campaign from Moscow.
Yeah. He makes no secret of where he allegiances lie. In September, he offered money to convince as many people as possible to vote no or to abstain in the EU referendum. And pro-European forces in Moldova have long warned of Russian interference in the election and referendum vote. One Moldovan news website said the election campaign had been marred by Russia's most slanderous, most violent and disruptive destabilization campaign since the country's independence.
So what about the legal implications? You mentioned money. Now, this is bribery, right? Is this illegal under the Electoral Code in Moldova? Can people be prosecuted for doing this?
Hard to answer, but these organizations, entities, and proxy groups find different legislative loops to convince them. But there are also some kind of risks, and a lot of Russian experts talk about that these people can just take this money from them and just vote according to their political preferences, which means support countries' EU integration process.
That would be a smart thing to do, in fact, unless, of course, the money can be traced back and someone can be accused of actually taking the bribe, in which case it's not actually that smart at all. But in any case, Russia has also been using funneling lots of money into other activities. This involves interference online by spreading fake news. Meta recently has been closing down profiles and botnets which were accused of basically, again, election interference, creating this sort of fake traffic online and spreading disinformation. So what does it tell us about the intensity of that activity? I mean, it does seem like Russia is really trying to find those weak points and exploit them.
Russia has a very long and I would say rich and common traditions in this regard, because this tradition has been started since the Brexit, and we see that the tendency is still kept. We see the similar approaches to different cases and different realities. For example, I remember almost every election that was held in the European Union countries. I remember the elections in the United States, and we see the same movement, but Americans did a great job and made very fruitful and I would say useful conclusions to how to fight back these tactics. But nothing has changed in this regard. Only one thing: the scale of operation has become more intensive and I would say sharper. Will it have a crucial impact on the outcomes of elections? I doubt, because you cannot change the mind of the citizens by conducting cyber operations or I would say propaganda narratives or disseminate various propaganda narratives on social networks. Yes, slightly it might have some impact, but generally watching and looking at the tendencies in Moldova, in Georgia, where also the scale of pro-Kremlin operations rise on a daily basis, I do not have an impression that they can directly impact. They use, of course, various think tanks, hired experts, foundations, non-governmental organizations, trolls, bots, and useful idiots to achieve these political goals. But one thing is very positive in this whole story, that they cannot, I would say, offer a novelty in this direction, and their modus operandi is quite well known by the wide range of the population in Moldova and in Georgia as well.
But looking at this from the standpoint of the ordinary person, perhaps someone who is still hesitant as to how they are going to vote. We, of course, know the benefits of joining the European Union, but what about the other side? What are they trying to offer? What are their main narratives? When they try to peddle their own narrative, what is it based on?
The biggest problem of the Russian Federation and the pro-Russian forces is the lack of and non-existence of soft power, because Moscow is not able to offer you something in return. The only thing in which Russia is sophisticated is the demonization of the West. Their narrative is more or less the following: we are not the best, we're not the ideal, but these guys are morally bankrupt, that they do not care for Christian values, that they support LGBTQI policy. For them, family values are not important, and all their propaganda is based on such primitive narratives and messages.
So far-right populism, what about the question of the war in Ukraine? Are they leaning heavily on the idea that the West is dragging your country into the war, we will ensure peace? Because we're seeing that in other countries as well.
Well, this approach is more relevant when we talk about Georgia, where the main propagandistic narrative of the government backed by Russia is constructed on the peace over the war. We can propose a peace while the West is dragging Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia into the war against Russia, which is not an aggressive country and is only obliged to respond to these threats. This is the general narrative, which in case of Moldova also is widely used and instrumentalized. But in Moldova, approach is a bit more different. For example, it is mainly constructed on the historic and cultural ties that Moldovans have with Russians, because a large part of Moldovan society, I would say, is quite pro-Russian, because a lot of them still work in Russia, speak Russian, and say that let's say they consider themselves as Russians as well. In case of Georgia, the scenario is different.
One quick question. There have been reports that there is a risk of basically people being trained by the Russians to use violence to instigate riots. Do you think this might actually mar the upcoming elections to some extent?
We cannot figure out this option, but look at the operations of Russia. Russia openly wanted to remove Pashinyan, who is the prime minister and pro-Western leader of Armenia. He became pro-Western after the catastrophic defeat in the Second Karabakh War. But Russia, which possesses 2 military bases and wholly controls Armenian economy, was not able to destabilize the situation in Armenia and remove the government, to replace Pashinyan's government with its own wishful candidate.
So there is a degree of unpredictability. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but we'll be returning to this topic. Grigol Julukhidze was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And I'm Ilan Shor, you're watching TVP World. Please do stay with us.